morning, my name is Olivia Rose.
I'm Charlotte Fisher.
And I'm Lizzy Detterman.
And today we will be presenting what makes a terrorist. Terrorism is defined by Merriam-Webster as the systematic use of terror, especially as a means of coercion. But what does it really mean? Dictionary definitions are of little help and are disappointingly unobliging when providing a description on this matter. Each of us individually have altered this definition in our mind as terrorism continues to be an ever-present threat creeping in on our collective peace of mind. In recent years, the fears that we all hold have spiked due to the rapid increase of terrorism. Since 2011, they are up by 38% in France, 21% in the UK, and 11% in the US, according to a survey released by the Pew Research Center last summer. And that was before Paris, San Bernardino, and Brussels. But as President Franklin D. Roosevelt so famously pointed out, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. To contest with a threat, it is better to understand the forces that shape it. That is where we can use science. What can psychology tell us about the mind of a suicide bomber? What are the patterns for terrorist recruits? What makes someone choose the terrorism path? Can we reclaim some of them before it's too late? Social psychologists Stephen D. Riker and S. Alexander Haslam make the case that most terrorists are not psychopaths or sadists, much as we would like to believe. Instead, the majority are ordinary people, shaped by a group dynamic to do harm in the name of a cause they find noble and just. The steep rise of terrorism is among one of the more disturbing trends in the world today. Between 2011 and 2014 alone, they shot up 80%. Many people jump to the conclusion that only psychopaths or sadists, individuals entirely different from us, are capable of strapping on a suicide vest or wielding an executioner's sword. But sadly, that assumption is flawed. Thanks to studies from the 1960s and 1970s, we know that even stable, well-adjusted individuals are capable of inflicting serious harm onto human beings on which they feel no grievance whatsoever. Stanley Milgram's oft-cited obedience to authority research showed that when asked by a researcher in a lab coat, volunteers were willing to administer what they believed to be lethal electric shocks onto others. Fellow psychologist Philip Zimbardo's infamous Stanford prison experiment revealed that when college students were assigned the parts of prison guards, they would humiliate and abuse other students who played the part of prisoners. These studies prove that virtually anyone under the right, or rather wrong circumstances, is capable of perpetrating acts of extreme violence. There is a large diversity among terrorists, and many people are vulnerable to terrorist recruitment. Radical Islam not only learn Muslims, but a majority are uninvolved in religion or even Christian or Jewish. 50% are not immigrants, but people who have been living in the United States or Europe their entire lives. Despite the diversity, terrorist recruiters enlist using the same 4 steps: isolate, renew, idolize, and dehumanization. The perfect example of this is with a boy named Alex living in an isolated part of Washington state. He begins to grow close to a group of friends online, the most attentive that he's ever had, and the isolation step begins. They spend hours a day together as they begin teaching him about the Muslim faith. At this point, he's dropped out of college and has stopped seeing his family and friends. Then the second stage begins. At this point, he's lost his own identity completely and has melted into the group. His car's radio is no longer turned to the Christian hits, but rather he begins humming along to the ISIS anthems blasting out of his iPhone. Once the third stage begins, he must adhere completely to his radical group's ideology. On his Twitter page, he pledges to his radical group and his newfound religion. When the fourth stage begins, Alex was being taught that anyone that was not on his same path of awakening was not really human, and therefore killing them is not a crime. Finally, Alex died as he became a suicide bomber.
Most people have a dramatic interpretation of what a terrorist really is. Terrorists are easily labeled as extremists, sociopaths, sadists, and psychopaths. Although, as we see with Alex, these people begin no different than us. One day, these recruits see the radical groups as gruesome executioners and can't believe how their activity can be fueled by religion. Then, a week later, they see anyone offering help as someone they need to kill. Some terrorists were never even recruited, being born into a place where terrorism is something to be proud of. Your religion is based off of what your parents believe in for the most part. For example, if your family is Catholic, you would most likely grow up as Catholic. Therefore, they do not have a choice, but they also do not think any wrong of it as a small child. It's what they have seen and grown up with. Although these children being born into terrorism make up a smaller percentage of terrorists. 82% of terrorist attacks occurring in the United States since 9/11 were performed by citizens or permanent residents, half born in the United States, as we see here on the graph. Since 2014, the majority of individuals charged in the United States with ISIS-related offenses have been U.S. citizens, 58%, or permanent residents, 6%, according to George Washington University's program on extremism. Ideology is the biggest reasoning for many terrorists and terrorist groups. Another misunderstood idea about ideology is that it's completely religion-based. Statistics from the University of Maryland show that ideology is extremely varied, from environmental to religious to nationalist. In this chart, ideology is behind terrorist attacks as shown, and religious affiliation is represented in gray, not even half. From a religious affiliation standpoint, these people are conformed by the group's dynamics, which are centered around their religion. Although these values are not their core beliefs of the entirety of the religion, giving terrorists the title of extremist. Individuals associated with a certain religion do not make them terrorist or extremist. Many could relate this to how Catholics believe in God or how the groups of people believe in their own God. Our purpose as Catholics is to follow Jesus' footsteps and live in the light of the Lord. From our perspective, this is what is right and what we are destined to do. These groups of people think that by being a suicide bomber or by sending missiles into buildings and sacrificing lives, including their own, is what their God believes in, which is extremism. This reason also pushes the psychology that these kinds of murderous and violent actions are normal. Another major problem in terrorism is homelessness. They recruit young teenagers that are experiencing homelessness and are looking for a place to stay by lurking the streets to pick and choose their targets. Now, as a teenager, you're most likely to be naive, and when you are in this horrible situation, you will do anything to find a solution. So you would probably say yes to these people who are providing a solution to your life crisis. As a teen, you are seeing two options. Say no and try to fight the odds of dying due to hunger, thirst, and lack of shelter, or say yes and join this group to avoid death by homelessness and maybe gain a few new friends. What would you choose? The answer to that question is a personal matter and can depend on your location, life situation, age, mental health, and awareness. These reasons do not make these unjust and homicidal actions normal or okay in any way. We are just providing you with a few facts and background information on how terrorism is spreading and how it has started. You're probably thinking about how you could just say no, put the weapons down, say no to the violence, and say no to these groups recruiting kids. It's not as easy as that. If it were, most of these problems would not be as apparent, and I would not be here talking to you about this pressing subject.
The real question is if terrorism is getting worse. Unfortunately, terrorism has been an ongoing problem for many years now. Overall, terrorism seems not just more lethal and more common, but more widespread. According to the University of Maryland's Global Terrorism Database, terrorist attacks have occurred in almost 100 countries as of 2015. Sadly, the number of fatalities in the world caused by terrorism-related attacks has increased over the years from less than 200 in 1970 to over 40,000 in 2014. With the increase in technology, it has become easier for terrorists to communicate their messages and threats to the world. It has generated a new source of recruitment, made it easier to coordinate global attacks, and provide better ways to evade surveillance. ISIS, one of the most well-known terrorist groups, has recruited thousands of foreign fighters through their campaign on the internet. The internet has as well affected our perspective of terrorism. The media's efforts to communicate a complex and convoluted message in a brief amount of time has led us to label any range of acts of violence as terrorism. Pick up a newspaper or turn on the television, and one can find an array of terrorist acts from bombings to assassinations.
Bruce Hoffman, the writer of Inside Terrorism, argues that, quote, terrorists are now able to bypass traditional print and broadcast media via the internet through inexpensive but professionally produced and edited videotapes, and even with their own dedicated 24/7 television and radio news stations. The consequences of these developments are far-reaching as they are still poorly understood, having already transformed the ability of terrorists to communicate without censorship. Terrorism has forced us to adapt our world to provide more safety and security. Since 9/11, our air travel, government, and many of the immigration systems have improved. Not only has our airport security become more modern and secure, but the airplanes themselves have also undergone major overhaul. Additionally, the immigration systems have become stricter. In 2002, the number of tourist visas given to Pakistani citizens fell almost 70%, and immigrant visas dropped nearly 40% compared to 2001. These results have greatly benefited the United States, but increasing our security can only do so much. When it comes to putting a stop to terrorism completely, the Catholic faith has the idea to condemn evil, reject hatred, trust in Christ, and pray. The Church believes that coming together in solidarity and peace is the only way to make a true difference. St. Paul reminds us that, quote, our struggle is not with the flesh and blood, but with the principalities, with the powers, with the world rulers of this present darkness, and with the evil spirits in the heavens. Terrorism is never okay. However, it is a part of our world. We understand as Catholics that this is a war that must be fought with spiritual and not merely military weapons. From John chapter 16, verse 33, the words of Christ himself tells us that, quote, in the world you will have trouble, but take courage, I have conquered the world. In the end, we have discovered that there is truly no real definition of terrorism. In fact, terrorism cannot be defined in one simple sentence. As Catholics, we believe in coming together in peace and solidarity. We are taught to love everyone, regardless of their religion, race, or gender. If we continue to do so, with hopes, terrorism will begin to decrease in the near future. Thank you.